Right. Knew that was going to happen. All right, well, Happy New Year, everybody. If you haven't been around in the last few weeks, things might be a little bit different here. We just wrapped up a 5-year journey on teaching through each of the books of the Bible. So that wrapped up 2 weeks ago. And this week marks the start of a new journey that we're kind of working through from a teaching perspective, going through the church calendar. So the church calendar starts in Advent. And so this is the first week of Advent. This is the first day of the new year of the Christian calendar. So again, Happy New Year. New Year is, for a lot of us, right, it's a time of reflecting and looking ahead to the year to come, maybe hoping that things will be different. I don't know how many of you keep like goals and resolutions, or at least make them, thinking that you'll naively keep them again this year. Right? It's sort of that magical time that you can have all the hope that things will be different because like you haven't actually started and screwed it up yet. So we have New Year's as that time. And in Advent, there's some similar parallels. Advent is a time of reflecting on the spiritual journey. There's a longing, a looking ahead, and anticipating. And it's mostly characterized by waiting for God to show up, waiting for our lives to be different, waiting for the world to be made new. And so it is in this spirit of waiting where we are hoping for what will come, but also waiting through the experience of what hasn't come yet. Now, the different aspects of the church calendar are called seasons. So like Advent would be a season. It typically is the end of November, early December, which in Ohio puts it like around winter, right? So it comes in the season of winter, that time when it's cold and dark and everything sort of has a grayscale around it and there's a strong resemblance of death everywhere. Winter in Ohio, there we go. And speaking of which, I was seeing how long I could go having a dead tree up here without mentioning it. So I know that this is dead, because I asked for a dead tree, and this is what I got. So I can tell you that it's dead, but to be honest, in this season, right, if this were planted outside, it wouldn't look much different than many other trees that we see, right? A lot of the trees and stuff outside right now have that appearance of death. It's a time where, life has retreated for a little bit. We have people that retreat during winter, right? We have folks from our church that are down in Florida right now for a few months. Some of you retreat, like you pretty much stay in your home except for necessities, and if this is one of those, then thanks for coming. My wife, even in our very own house, like my wife retreats, like she's under no less than 2 blankets at all times until about April, and that's like covered up to the nose with just the eyes exposed. But there's a purpose. There's a purpose to the seasons. Right? There's a purpose in winter where life retreats to protect itself from the elements. It's sort of a painful time for plants. And so life retreats as a way of protecting itself and as a way of waiting for spring to pop up when the conditions are better for life to kind of burst forth again. Now, Mike shared last week, which I recommend listening to about the church calendar, that the reason we're going through it, like the purpose of it, is for our own formation. And so for each season in the church calendar that we experience, there's a purpose to it, for us to be formed, to be shaped, to lean into a new set of rhythms that are going to shape us slowly over time. And so, just like in winter, where it feels like life might be distant or life has retreated, in Advent we recognize the ways that life feels distant to us. We recognize that, we might be in times in our life where we have permission to really admit that we have times in our life where life feels distant, it feels dark and cold and lonely. And so it is in that space that this season every year we try to lean into that. Our tension is to try to skip past it, right? We want to skip ahead to spring. We want to skip ahead, past the waiting. We just want to get to the thing. But for our own formation, for our own growth, there's a wisdom to being fully present in the season to receive it as a gift. Because when we name what that is, when we name what's hard, when we name what feels distant, then we know every year we are reminded what it is that we are hoping for and waiting for and longing for in Jesus. So, thank you, tree. Move you back. So similar to onions and ogres, there are layers to Advent. Shrek reference if nobody caught it. So there's sort of the obvious layer that we are imitating and celebrating and recognizing the birth narrative of Jesus, right? The 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus, the golden fleece diapers and the balled up fist. No, but that it's the birth narrative of Jesus. That's the initial layer. But then there's a deeper historical layer to Advent, and that's for us to really experience a solidarity with our spiritual ancestors, with the people of Israel and all that they've gone through, the full story of the Old Testament of slavery and exile and ups and downs and pains and hardships and thousands of years of waiting and looking for God to show up through the Messiah. And so we give ourselves a few weeks to lean into that, to experience that solidarity. And so that's another layer. But then there's also the sort of present spiritual reality for us, that we know that Jesus came, and so we acknowledge that Jesus came, and yet the dream for which he gave his life has not yet fully come to reality. And so we find ourselves, on this side of the birth of Christ, still waiting for something to come, and still trying to acknowledge what it is we are waiting for, where it is we are looking for God to show up. Each week of the church calendar, there are scripture passages that are sort of associated with it. It comes from the Revised Common Lectionary. We have more of that information on our website if you're interested. And again, I will make a plug to listen to Mike's message from last week, because he kind of does a good overview of all of this. But each week of the year has, an Old Testament and a psalm typically, and a gospel passage and a New Testament passage that's supposed to be kind of fitting for that week. And so for us, as we're on this new journey, we're going to be mostly teaching through the gospel ones, the ones directly related to Jesus. However, I wanted to start this morning with an Old Testament passage from Jeremiah. So it's in Jeremiah 33. And it's the prophet, and he's saying this: "The day will come, says the Lord, when I will do for Israel and Judah all the good things I have promised them. In those days and at that time, I will raise up a righteous descendant from King David's line. He will do what is just and right throughout the land. In that day, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety, and this will be its name: the Lord is our righteousness." So hopefully it's a little obvious, or at least makes sense why this passage might be included in the Advent season. Right? It's talking about hope and the Messiah coming. And if we're not careful, when these passages are sort of assigned to us, we can kind of keep it at that surface layer. Right, we can look at how it's pointing towards the Messiah and sort of keep it at that level. But again, there are layers, and we're challenged and encouraged to go deeper. And so remember that these are, yes, words of hope from Jeremiah, but go back and listen, or go back and study and recall that Jeremiah was a prophet in Israel at a time that they had split into two nations, split into two kingdoms. And the empire of Babylon had taken them over and had put thousands of people into exile. And Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was dismantled. And so it was a time of turmoil. It's a time when Israel and the people in it were hurting and lost and hopeless. Now, I think there's a few different kinds of hopelessness. I think there's a hopelessness that comes from helplessness, kind of like being in exile under a foreign oppressor. maybe some of us this morning are here in this season with a feeling of helplessness in our life, right? It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be a difficult time at work. It could be a relationship struggle. It could be a diagnosis. Anything that is just out of our control, that is causing some type of pain that we feel helpless to. And again, Advent reminds us that we all will have these times in our life that we experience that. But it also reminds us that while we are helpless, we should never be without hope. And so that's part of the forming of this season. And I think that's what the Jeremiah passage speaks to. Now, I think there's at least one other kind of hopelessness, and it comes from sort of the opposite of that. It comes from a lack of helplessness, right? It comes from an avoiding of any real need. And so if we're not careful, we find ourselves without needing anything of which to hope for. And so I think it's in this place that Jesus speaks to in the Luke passage. In Luke 21, should be on the screen. And he says, "Watch out. Don't let your hearts be dulled by carousing and drunkenness and by the worries of this life. Don't let that day catch you unaware like a trap, for that day will come upon everyone living on earth. Keep alert at all times and pray that you might be strong enough to escape these coming horrors and stand before the Son of Man." All right, so that one's a little less obvious as to why it connects to Advent. So this is Jesus talking, so that means this is after the birth. I know. After the birth of Jesus. This is Jesus talking, and yet he's coming to terms and explaining to us how we are still waiting for something to come, right? So there's the layer of Jesus coming, but then there's the layer of, this dream that he has shared, this vision of the kingdom of God that he has shared is not yet here. And so it's in that sort of place, that place where a lot of us might be, that he's saying, don't let your hearts be dulled, right? That we have a lot of times this tendency to try to avoid things that are difficult and hard, to detach from suffering around us, right? And to sort of dull our hearts. I looked this up. I thought it was interesting. Hopefully you do. But as individuals in our country, last year, we spent roughly $336 billion on legal recreational drugs. So alcohol, tobacco, vaping, marijuana. All right, so that as individuals, we contributed roughly $336 billion towards legal drugs like that. To put it in perspective, we contributed, as individuals, contributed like $286 billion to charitable giving. Now, I'm not up here making a moral judgment about that. So please hear this. This isn't a moral judgment. But in the season of Advent, this is a spiritual observation and a question maybe for you and for me this morning. Are there things that we are using to escape? Are there things that we are using in our life to detach, to dull our hearts around us? And so, Jesus talks about drunkenness. That seems to be fairly obvious. That'll dull the heart. That'll dull a lot of things. But the other thing that he compares it to, or puts on the same level with it, is the worries of this life. And so worry, that sort of pops up in more subtle sort of ways. And I think for us, in our kind of culture, that busyness is a way that we often sort of fill our times, fill our lives, that we respond to worries of this life. There was an economist in the 1930s who predicted that his grandchildren would only be working 10 to 15 hours a week, that because of the advent of technology and how much we were able to produce, that we were only going to be working 10 to 15 hours a week. Most of us in here, if we are working, are working a little bit more than 10 hours a week. And so as a culture, we've just chosen to increase our expectations for production. Right? So rather than decreasing our time, we've increased our expectations for production. and productivity. And it's similar to the same idea with like the mass adoption of the car, right? So the car was invented, and it came out at a time that it could have reduced our travel times, but in many ways we've just increased our travel distances. And you've got certain cities in our country where you're spending a lot of time in just the car and as a part of travel. And so I think a lot of our technology we use, that it can save us time, but then like we immediately find different ways to fill it, right? And I know that like travel times, like there has been progress with it, okay? We're not like fording the Mississippi River on the Oregon Trail, all right? We don't have to, with the threat of dysentery. But do we use things? Do we use technology? Do we use work? Do we use activities? Do we schedule our kids? Do we do things in a way that we fill our schedule so that we don't have to think about or sit with or deal with the hard things that are around us? And again, this isn't a moral judgment against like productivity, but a spiritual observation. Are there areas in your life where you are trying to maybe fill your time so that you can avoid something? You know, if we're honest, the busier that we are, the easier it is to not have to think about, right? The easier it is to detach ourselves from the suffering of others, whether that's in our lives or in the world around us. And so I think it is in this sort of space that Jesus is speaking, that we should be the types of people, the kinds of people that risk having full hearts, right? Risk dealing with and addressing and acknowledging pain that's around us. Because we know, and we are reminded every year, that we are never without hope, that we shouldn't lose hope, that we don't need to lose hope, that we can trust God. And so, but we are in this sort of tension to simultaneously hold on to, and lean into the suffering that's around us, and without losing hope. There's a book called Good to Great, which I think a lot of people have probably read. The author, Jim Collins, he calls this kind of tension the Stockdale paradox. It's named after Admiral James Stockdale, who was the highest-ranking military official imprisoned in Vietnam. And so he was held and repeatedly tortured for over 8 years. And the paradox lies in the way that he was able to make it out alive where others perished. From an interview with him, he said, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which in retrospect, I would not trade." When he was asked who didn't make it out, he said the optimists. He said they were the ones that said we'd get out by Christmas, and then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And he said they said we'd be out by Easter, and then Easter would come and Easter would go. And they said we'd be out by Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving would come, and soon it'd be Christmas again. And he said they died of a broken heart. And so the paradox is this: you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. So we must never lose hope or faith, but we also need to be able to confront the brutal facts and hardships and realities that are around us. I think in Christianity, we seem to be pretty good at the hope thing, or at least we use the language of hope. A lot of times when we say hope, we sort of mean like wishing. Like it's like wishing is like a substitute for action. But true hope is the language that we use, and so that's what we need to hold on to. However, I wonder if we don't struggle a little bit with being brutally honest with what's around us. That a lot of times we use hope and say, I don't have to do anything about that because God will take care of it, right? And so we use that as a way to cover up the brutal facts, the reality, the hardships, the suffering that's around us. And so this season for us is about holding on to both. There's a prayer liturgy that I've been going through that I wanted to share a quote from for this season. Right? As this is a time of hope, we must never forget that Jesus comes from Nazareth, right? A town that folks said nothing good could come from. And he knew suffering the moment he entered the world as a baby refugee born in the middle of a genocide. Right? That Jesus knew poverty and pain until he was executed on a Roman cross. And that this is the Jesus we are called to follow. With his coming, we learn that the most dangerous place for Christians to be is in comfort and safety, detached from the sufferings of others. Places that are physically safe can be spiritually deadly. My hope for us this morning, and my prayer for us this morning through this time of season, that this is about waiting and preparing and being formed. And the first step of that is to be able to accept and use this season as a gift, right? To be quiet, to slow down, to reflect, to regroup, to acknowledge the ways where that life feels distant, right? To acknowledge the pain and the suffering around us, to do the work of trying to name what it is that we are longing for, and that in turn will fuel our longing for Jesus. So, my real question for us today, for all of us, is this: Can you name where you are waiting and hoping and longing for Jesus? And I think equally important with that is, do you believe he is actually the answer to your longing?